Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's class. We are talking today, myself, Ryan, Hassan, and Matt Nettleton, about suffering. What a beautiful topic to talk about on a Friday morning. Thank you, everyone who has put in where they are listening or watching from today. We really appreciate that. It looks like we have people from all around the world today: Alberta, Canada, Adelaide in Australia, Maroubra Beach up in New South Wales, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the UK, Winnipeg, Manitoba. Cool sounding place. Harvey Bay, Queensland, Sheffield in the UK, New Jersey, Northern Rivers, and Texas of the USA. Really appreciate all of you joining us on this live call. We like an active chat box. Any comments or questions you have along the way, don't hesitate to put them in there. We will do our best to get to them all. And for those who don't know us, my name is Ryan Hassan. I'm joined by Matt Kay. We're the creators of Embodied Processing, a modality for being able to deal with traumatic imprints, stored stress in the body, and to help us become lighter and free ourselves from a lot of the self-sabotages and patterns that we all run into to varying degrees in this life. When we do these live classes, myself and Matt, I normally reach out to him and say, hey, what's a good topic that we can talk about? And we'll normally talk about something, we've done working with anger in the past. We've done anxiety in the past. Your cat there, Matt, getting some screen time. We've done a few different issues. And I thought to myself, let's do maybe something to do with inner confidence, self-esteem, self-worth, or maybe something to do with physical health. And Matt just said to me, why don't we just talk about actually suffering itself and what actually causes suffering and why we suffer, and how we can be free from that. So very excited today. Matt, you excited about this topic? One of your favorites?
Yep. Am I lagging at all? I am on my end, but
Yeah, no, it's okay. You're coming through clear on this end.
great.
Can
Yep,
everyone
I'm
just let me know
excited.
in the comments if we can hear Matt okay?
Hello, hello, hello.
Okay, I'll turn you up to full. That'll get it going. All right, so what is suffering? So, I put in the blurb of this live. Okay, we've got a yes from someone in the comments. Fantastic. That there are two types of suffering that we experience as human beings. And there's two different ways of putting it. I've put them both here. I put in the blurb of this live necessary versus unnecessary suffering. But you can also call it pain versus suffering. That might be an actually easier way to put it. And there is a distinction about that. We'll get to this more in the slides to come, but we don't go through this human existence without pain. A lot of us wish for a life with no pain, and that is not a wish that's ever going to be delivered. However, suffering, we do have some control over that. We do have a relationship with that. We don't have to suffer day in, day out, and it depends a lot on what we're going to talk about today. So, Matt, do you want to start off by talking about a bit of your distinction between pain and suffering?
Sure. And like suffering, especially people who follow Buddhism and stuff, like the Buddha used the word dukkha, and I've heard it said like suffering is actually not a great translation of the word dukkha. What's a better translation is dissatisfaction. No, so dissatisfaction with life, kind of resistance to what is, wanting things to be different, craving and aversion. When we think of suffering, it's like we break our leg, and that's a form of suffering. We're in pain, and the difference to me there between the pain and the suffering is the actual sensation of a broken leg is uncomfortable. Obviously, it's going to be painful. We could actually call that suffering. That's like physical suffering, but to actually kind of discern like what an inner form of suffering is versus the actual pain of the experience, or the necessary versus unnecessary. Like the necessary suffering is obviously the physical actual sensations there. The unnecessary suffering is kind of the self-reflective consciousness, the story that we have. Oh, like, terrible things always happen to me. Why do I always break my leg? I wish my leg wasn't broken so I could go and kick the footy or go to work or blah, blah, blah. So we get this big narrative overlaid, like kind of superimposed on top of the actual broken leg itself. So reality is I've got a broken leg and it's painful. Then there's this extra kind of layer there that's not necessary. It's just a bunch of thoughts kind of superimposing a reality on top of the actuality of the broken leg. That's unnecessary, and it's always only there because we never question it. We just believe it. Our attention's kind of glued on this, and we create this identity out of it, like, bad things always happen to me, there's something wrong with me, why does my leg always get broken, etc., 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 infinite variations of that. story, but we essentially like impregnate the experience with meaning. And that meaning, very often creates an extra layer of uncomfortability, of resistance, of identity, of self in the experience that causes an extra layer of kind of friction on top of it, dissatisfaction in a sense. And that inner friction creates the suffering. The actual pain on its own without that superimposed layer, we could say, well, that's a form of suffering, but it's not. It's necessary. It's by itself. It's actuality. It's naked. It's the actual experience happening.
I was talking to my colleague Nick, who I do a podcast with yesterday. I said we were doing a class on suffering, and then he was just relaying a client that he had this week, and you were talking about the actuality of what is and the layers that we put on top of it. So someone has asked if this will be recorded. Yes, it will. It'll be available on the feed after we finish. It'll also be available as a blog on the Centre for Healing website later on today. And he was talking about, this client that he was seeing, and she was just very much stuck in rumination about an ex-boyfriend and just couldn't get out of it. And it's like, whatever we resent or infatuate with will run on loop in our mind and run our lives. And so in this instance, she resented an ex-boyfriend. So a tape runs on loop. Okay, even though she's not with the boyfriend anymore, it's how he did me wrong, poor me, all this kind of stuff. And she came in, and my friend Nick said she went for about 15 or 20 minutes on a ramble about this. And he said, is it okay if we sit in the reality of what's happening right now? She goes, sure, what's that? And he said, lady sitting in a chair. And then he goes, we spent the next half an hour trying to deconstruct that was all that was happening in her direct experience, was a lady sitting in the chair across from him. And that all this other stuff was this overlay, this unnecessary suffering, this ruminating, this regret, this wishing the past was different, and that she'd done things differently. And so that is what we are talking about when we are talking suffering and unnecessary suffering. It's this overlay, it's the ruminating, and they come from very, very different places. That's not to say, okay, now that I know it, bang, I'll snap out of it and stop. It can take some work to unwind why we ruminate, and we'll get to that in a minute. We cannot do a talk, myself and Matt, without talking about trauma. That is our jam. That is what we teach. It's what we've been teaching for a very, very long time. And one of the causes of suffering in this life are traumatic imprints. What happens in a trauma? We're recording everything that happens to us all the time, us human beings. We're adapting to our environment from when we're in the womb up until right now, trying to work out how to best survive in the environment that we've come into. Although every situation is recorded, not everyone is given great importance. We are given great importance at the extremes, okay? At the extremes of what we would deem negativity, or the extremes of what we would call positivity. When we talk about traumatic imprints, it's what we deem, or our system deems, as negative in the moment. And so we don't just experience pain in the moment of a traumatic imprint, and that can be sexual abuse, physical abuse, the classic ideas being away at war, these classic ideas of what we think trauma is. If you've heard me and Matt talk, it can also be a hell of a lot of different things. It can be feeling that subtle rejection from your father through your developmental years. It can be putting your hand up in class as a sensitive kid and being laughed at over and over again, made to feel like you can't speak up and will never be heard, and have that embarrassment and shame along with it. We don't just experience pain in these events as they happen, we carry them forth with us. That's why they are called imprints. They don't leave us unless we start to unravel it, normally many years later as an adult, as we come into this work. So whenever we go through a traumatic experience, yes, we experience pain in that moment, but we experience suffering from that day forth, because part of our psyche will remain hypervigilant for anything it deems similar that might happen in the future. And so we were always looking around the corner like, man, am I going to experience that bullying again that I did in primary school, even though it's 20 years later and we're not in an environment for that? That part of us is still very active. Me and Matt used the example of the kid putting their hand up in class and feeling embarrassment and shame. 20 or 30 years later, we can go to speak up in a relationship or with our boss because our needs aren't being met. And that same person in grade 2, that younger version of us, will pull back and get very, very scared and very, very shameful. So these imprints carry through time. And my God, they cause so much human suffering. It is unbelievable. We've said this many times. I think in healthcare, globally, healthcare, understanding and recognizing trauma, not just in mental and emotional health and addictions, but also physical health, is one of the key elements that's missing when we look at this stuff. Any thoughts there, Matt?
Just that, like trauma, it's unmetabolized experience, anything that lives in us, that continues to loop and then limit the way we function in the world. So just like what you said about putting our hand up in class, and then everyone laughs at us, and we get that kind of knot in the gut that says, "An idiot! Like, why'd you ask that question?" You know, maybe in that language, maybe not in that language, and that knot kind of contracts, leaves an imprint, unless it's metabolized and spikes and moves through and completes itself in the moment. And a number of factors will determine whether it's able to do that or whether it gets stuck. The next time we go to put our hand up, we won't. We'll get that same knot come up. Something will say, no, don't do it. And sorry, one sec. My dog's just getting my cat. Oh, good. I can't hear you now for some reason.
Sorry, everyone. I just left myself on mute. Melissa wish she has that function sometimes, but I just muted myself. I was just saying that while Matt was separating the animals, we'll move on. But you'll find that a lot of the slides and the topics that we talk about, there'll be some overlap, and there'll be a lot of different themes as we move through them, even though some of them are different. But you'll see that. So keep going, Matt, and then we'll move on to craving and aversion, which this golden fella here was talking about many years ago.
So, like putting our hand up in class and we get that knot, if that knot doesn't complete, we go to put our hand up next time, the same knot will come up and say, it's not safe, don't do it. So then developmentally, we've become limited in our expression, in the way we function, in our capability for connection, in relationship, in trust, in other people, etc., etc., etc. All those things have been arrested in their capacity for development. And this is a kind of natural thing. It's part of the human experience. And then what will happen is we create a narrative is, I don't want this to be here. I need this to go away. There's something wrong with me. I need to fix this. So all those layers of unnecessary suffering on top of that experience starts to happen. And we develop an identity out of that. It turns into personality traits, like we become anxious, we become avoidant, or we become anxiously attached, or etc., etc., etc. All these different ways the personality can become oriented from those kinds of distressing experience that still live in us. So that's how kind of we look at trauma, and it ties straight into suffering and dissatisfaction and self, and identity.
Yeah, so true. And tying that in as well to craving and aversion, the Buddha 2,500 years ago was talking about this. And, as we go through life, we wish for a one-sided life. We wish for things to be other than what reality is presenting. And so we crave that which we want. And I use inverted commas because most of the time, the things that we think we want, when we get them, we realize, I don't know why I wanted this in the first place. And we are adverse to those things that we think are going to cause us discomfort or struggle or challenge, which once again, we think that we don't want, although the challenges that we go through in life are the greatest opportunities for growth, where we find out the most about ourselves. We just don't like going through them at the time. So we end up going through life craving the things that we seek and having an aversion to the things that we don't want. That's not the way to live life. We're not going to be able to get through life with a one-sided lens like that. So
Someone just spoke about, so in the comments said attachment. So attachment is another way of saying craving and aversion in that kind of language, in the Buddhist language, because when we say attachment, attachment to caregivers, we're talking about a healthy form of attachment, an attachment that helps ground us and land us here, helps us to self-regulate, etc., etc. When the Buddhists say the root cause of suffering is attachment, they're talking about craving and aversion. So craving and aversion is a form of suffering, one of the main forms of suffering. And if we can look at it this way, say I've got like an uncomfortable feeling in my body, overwhelming. If I don't have the capacity to be with that sensation, I'm going to have an aversion to it and a craving for relief. And that's really what addiction is, So a craving and aversion is synonymous with addiction. It is addiction. I have an aversion to this and a craving for something else. And that's, foundational to human consciousness on this planet. That's what drives us, craving and aversion. Addiction drives human consciousness. And, so the remedy for that is to learn to be with our experience in a way that isn't push or pull, that isn't running away, rejecting, finding things to relieve it, etc., etc., etc. We develop our own inner resources and our own capacity to be with our experience. And when we learn to be with our experience in a healthy way and learn to self-regulate, the system starts to metabolize all of these imprints from our childhood and the kind of stored suffering that lives in us. When we learn to be with it in a way that isn't kind of perpetuating narratives of deficiency and identity, and this means there's something wrong with me, etc., 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 we can kind of start to deconstruct and see through all these ways that we create a self out of it, and we perpetuate craving and aversion. And we learn, say we've got anxiety, we develop a capacity to be with the actual raw energetic experience. Then that reaching, wanting something to be different, to move away from it, can start to ebb away. And then we can have anxiety without suffering, or without the kind of inner friction. It's like anxiety on top of anxiety, like anxiety in its purest form is just raw sensation, raw energy moving through the body. When we kind of see through and take away those layers of superimposed narratives, stories, identities, etc., and can just be with the raw energy, then the energy can actually start moving. It's like we have a lid on it when we've got that. And that is the cycle of craving and aversion. That's how it happens. It happens by the narrative, grasping, attachment, grasping at things, wanting things to be different, etc., etc., etc. But if we can learn to be with our experience as it is, our inner subjective environment, then things can start to move and actually metabolize, and a deeper kind of intelligence starts to take over. Same intelligence that heals our cuts and digests our food, etc., etc. It's like getting out of our own way.
Yeah, it's the not okayness, that we experience. If you use the anxiety example, immediately people who are struggling with anxiety and seeking treatment, it's like, I just want the anxiety to go away. And so there's this not okayness with the anxiety, which means that we are now going to create more anxiety because we're not okay with that and we're desperately trying to get out of it. But as Matt said, it's not easy at first. At first, it's quite a foreign concept. But as soon as we can contain that by building enough of a resource and capacity within ourselves, then it's okay for anxiety to be here. And now we're in a very, very different relationship with anxiety. So we're in relationship to every thought, every sensation that we have. Okay, it comes up. The only reason that I know I'm anxious is because there's a part of me, an awareness that's going, hey, I'm feeling anxious. So there's some sort of distance there. So I'm now in a relationship to it. So when I can start to be okay with that, or when sadness arrives, when grief arrives, when anger arrives, when I can contain those, then I have a very, very different experience of them. I'm experiencing them in their rawest form, like Matt said, but I'm not overlaying it with the, my God, overlay, 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 overlay. And, a lot of people that we see, it's like an emotion that, could have come and gone in a matter of minutes is active in the system for days, weeks, months, even years, because we simply will not develop the tools to be with it and be okay with that being there so it can move through. Like Matt said, it's not like we need to force a lot of these uncomfortable sensations through. They want to move through our system. They want to give us feedback and move through. However, we stop them. We stop them with this thing most of the time, which is what we're very good at.
It's what you said, like changing our relationship to it. So, the normal orientation is craving and aversion. I want this anxiety to go away. I crave relief. I crave something else other than this. But that orientation of EP, that's a kind of dysfunctional relationship to ourselves. We're rejecting ourselves. We're rejecting a part of ourselves. And anxiety is often created by wounds that are stuck in the nervous system, and the nervous system stuck vibrating sympathetically in fight or flight. That's kind of what anxiety is, a threat response. And so, what would you do to a baby who's stuck in a threat response? We need to fix you. It's like you help soothe it. You would bring a functional relationship, a loving presence, supportive energy to that anxiety. and that anxiety would naturally start to calm down. You learn to be with it, you learn to contain it. And so, changing our relationship to it. Because if we want to fix it and make it go away, then it results in, layers of suppression or, repression, trying to get rid of it, etc. And that creates another inner conflict. And, it's interesting, we do this so unconsciously, and there's so many layers to this. And this isn't so much about, well, don't do that. It's just make conscious all the ways you do. Start to see, oh, wow, yeah, when I get anxiety, I really want it to go away, which creates another layer of friction and anxiety. On top of the anxiety, another layer of suffering. But if we start to investigate and see that we're doing that, make conscious, then we can actually change the attitude and the relationship to things.
Yeah, I mean, if you're kind of new to this work, you're tuning in today, and you take one thing from this talk, please let it be that you're just in relationship to everything you experience. Next time that you start to get angry, you don't be like, oh, I'm angry again. I know what happens now. You can just say, oh, anger's here. Anger's present. I wonder what this is about. I wonder what this is trying to teach me. And create a relationship with it. Understand it. How do you experience anger in the body or anxiety in the body? Where? How do you know? And all of a sudden, when we understand the qualities and develop a relationship, we can start to interact differently. And interacting differently with these parts and these sensations is so important, because up until now, the vast majority of human beings, we just react unconsciously. It's very automatic. It's very reactive. And so that's why the same patterns of behavior and the same patterns of feeling and thinking seem to go over and over and over again. And we struggle to break those patterns. So this one here is really talking about suffering as when we resist change. It says suffering occurs to when we try to make permanent that which is impermanent. The universe's inherent nature is that everything is impermanent. Everything will come and go in its own time. Yet us human beings, our egos very much want to cling on to things staying the same, especially when we perceive them to be going good or going right. Okay. This may be when we see a friend, and a friend has changed over the years, and we wish they were the same person they were when we were teenagers and hanging out, or a partner, or whoever it is. When we resist the natural changes of life, we are going to go into so much unnecessary suffering, because that is the nature. It's like telling, a tree when it's a little bud out of the ground. It's like, oh, why'd you go into a big tree? Can't you go back to a sapling? Don't resist change. It's part of the universe.
It's also feelings, good feelings come and go, negative feelings, I hate that term, let's call them uncomfortable feelings come and go. They are impermanent, and they're all a part of the spectrum, flux, and flow of life. And the suffering happens when we try to make this permanent and this go away, and then that's the craving and aversion, and we end up in inner conflict. And then every time a negative emotion arises, anger or whatever, what we judge and superimpose and label as negative, anger's, a very common one. Oh, I got angry again, there's something wrong with me. So then we start that identity, that self-narrative, which is the layer of suffering. The truth is, anger arose. That's a part of the human experience. Like, say, you go up to a mother lioness, try to take one of its cubs, it's going to get angry. A burst of anger will come up in the moment, protective, like kind of maternal energy. And then, you put the cub back and go off. It's not going to sit there, for the next 3 days. Oh my God, I got angry. It's like, it was just a
Can't believe I flew off the handle again. Oh,
Yeah, no, I always do that.
I
Went to
always
been to
do that,
therapy.
yeah.
Yeah, I've done EP, I've done RCT, and
Yeah.
like I still,
I've done it again. I'm such a
yeah,
failure.
yeah, nothing works for me, etc., etc. And so, like it was. The truth is, it was a wave that came. It's like the waves on the ocean. The ocean can be heaving with power. The ocean can be still. The ocean can have like huge, waves, tsunamis, and be destructive and all of that sort of stuff. It's like the ocean holds all these expressions, and so do we. It's like a force of nature, these emotions. We didn't create them. Humans didn't sit down one day and like write a list of, all right, let's create this emotion anger, let's create this emotion fear, let's create this emotion, etc., etc. What we did do is superimpose layers on top of them and say, this one's good, this one's bad, this one's negative, this one's positive, etc., etc. I need to get to this, make these ones go away, and this one, and try to be a perfect person. And I'm not at all in alignment with any ideas of perfection. It's like the idea of wholeness, which includes the whole of the human experience, is much more realistic to me. where it's like all of these emotions are included, all of these emotions are allowed. They're part of, the isness of reality. They're part of the flux of life. They're part of the impermanence. They change, shift, they fluctuate. They're the movement of reality, part of a continuum. And it's when we label them as negative, positive, when we superimpose, when we create identities out of them, that's the extra layer of suffering. And then we try to make the impermanent permanent. There's some
Yeah.
final state where we're perfect. It's not true. It doesn't exist.
No,
But we're
no.
sold every.
Let go of the idea of perfection. Just to go back to the ocean analogy on that last slide as well. It's like if I'm a surfer and I go to the ocean and this particular beach has beautiful waves one day and I have a great day surfing, and then I go back there the next day and it's still the same beach, and then I'm like, oh, this is bullshit. It should be like it was yesterday. That's what we're talking
Yeah.
about. Unnecessary
Yeah.
suffering.
Yeah.
A layer over
Reality.
the top.
Yeah. An argument with reality.
Yeah, I
That's
call
what
it
it is.
wrestling with reality.
Yeah.
You're not
Exactly.
going to win.
Wrestling. Like an inner conflict that happens, and that's the unnecessary kind of suffering that's there. The necessary suffering is the reality of things.
Yeah. Just before I go into this next slide, we just had a comment up earlier. It was a question, I believe. I'm in the middle of the EP training. Can this be used for adolescents, or what's the minimum age? You can definitely do resourcing with adolescents and children. The other parts of EP, it would depend on their maturity. Yeah, but it very much depends
And
on the maturity.
you can adapt the techniques as well. Like my 2-year-old and 5-year-old, like we get them to name feelings in their body, notice in their body where it is, ask them if there's a shape, there's a color. We've got little kind of hourglass things with different faces on them, and they go and get that. It's like that's EP because it's cultivating body awareness with safety,
Yeah,
curiosity. So you can adapt the techniques to suit different ages. Like I wouldn't be able to sit there with my 2-year-old and take them through a formal EP session, but like in daily life, we can integrate understandings and make it a lifestyle, and we can
yeah,
use resourcing, etc., and build safety with them in the same way we would with a client. You know,
absolutely.
um,
Yeah,
yeah.
and someone else here has just written, yeah, my kids are 9 or 11 and we use a form of EP frequently. It's brought a lot of presence and self-awareness and less reactivity in our lives. Amazing, amazing. And yeah, what Matt's talking about, my son's 4 and he had the other day at karate, we were on the way home and I'm like, oh, when you couldn't do that thing, how was that? And he goes, oh, yeah, I was angry. He goes, do you know how I was angry, Dad? And I'm like, how? He goes, because I could feel it in here and in here. And I'm like, oh, God. It just brings a tear to my eye because that took me about 30 years to work out that stuff. So it's brilliant. So the next one here is pursuing a one-sided life. I've touched on this already. We have what we would call, I guess, a fantasy that we should have a one-sided life. Life is full of support and challenge. Okay, ideally we have about an equal balance of support and challenge because that's where maximal growth occurs. Most things in nature, they all grow at the point of support and challenge. Yet we believe that we should always be supported and never be challenged. We should always have pleasure and not have pain. Coming from myself and Matt, two former drug addicts, that's the addict like. It just let me just seek pleasure and avoid pain at all costs. But not just drug addicts and alcoholics are doing that. We're all doing that to a degree. Whatever we think will make us feel safe and avoid pain. So when we are truly on path and on mission, and we are, I suppose, grounded in who we are and what we're doing, we understand that no matter what path we take in life, there's going to be support and challenge. Think about a relationship. We think our partner should just always make us happy and that's it, and we should always support us. No, they should challenge you just as much as they support you, and you should do the same for them. So very, very important. Stored
Just someone
suffering.
asked.
Matt, you've touched on this already. Yep.
Someone asked, "What is EP?" So EP is emotional processing. Now it's called embodied processing. It's my and Ryan's practitioner training that we train practitioners, therapists, coaches, etc., to work with trauma, stored stress, etc., in the nervous system. So it's one of the Center for Healing's
Yeah.
training.
I'll touch on it briefly at the end of this talk as well. But if you just type in embodied processing in Google, it'll come straight up. Stored suffering, Matt, nervous system states, inner conflicts.
Yeah. So like nervous system states, we kind of touched on that. We can either be stuck in fight or flight, freeze, collapse, etc. So we can be stuck in kind of states of anxiety or depression, and these states actually give rise to the story. So, you know, the idea that our thoughts create our feelings, well, that's not necessarily true. Yes, we can consciously elicit a thought that will then create a specific nervous system state, but 99% of the time, the process happening unconsciously is bottom up. So Deb Dana, who was the main translator of polyvagal theory, Stephen Porges' work into kind of clinical application, she's got a beautiful quote. It's very simple, you know, story follows state. And we all know that experience. We walk into a room and you can just feel someone's angry. It's like, you know, say we're, you know, in childhood, dad has, you know, is in a bad mood home from work and he's sitting there reading the paper. We come in the door, we're behind him. You can just feel it. Oh, yeah, he's in a bad mood. You know, kind of that emotional, hypervigilant monitoring. Our nervous system responds straight away. And then our system will fall into a specific state to cope with that. And then it will give rise to thoughts. So these energies, these states of our nervous system, sympathetic, parasympathetic, and the other branches, they give rise to the narrative and it kind of sprouts up. So it's bottom up processing. And like I said, yes, we can elicit and evoke consciously certain thoughts that will then change a state, you know, so it can work bottom down consciously, but unconsciously the processing is happening first. And that's because our nervous system develops sensing our environment before words and thoughts enter our mind. You know, so it's bottom up processing for a baby, you know, an infant. It's taking in its surroundings. Its nervous system is sensing its environment. It's like one giant sensing organ. And then the thoughts they think are an actual product of the processing that their nervous system has done prior to that. So it happens unconsciously. And those nervous system states, they can create all sorts of inner conflicts, different parts fighting with each other, different parts ignoring each other, different parts dissociated, different parts resisting each other. And we can end up in these states of inner push and pull. And constantly in that state, you know, like it's just inner resistances and frictions, and it really shows up as contractions in the body, like, oh, my back, you know, my back's always so sore and contracted, or I get this knot in my belly, my shoulders, like I'm like this. And that's that inner gripping, that inner tension. And, you know, so inner conflicts can be a cause of suffering, of, you know, great suffering. And inner
And think
conflicts are
about
just
those
one.
inner conflicts. It's those, me and Matt, he mentioned parts, and we work with it so much in EP. And like, how often do we all put my hand up? You know, how often do we have arguments with ourselves up here where it's like one party wants to go that way, the other one's like, no, that's stupid. We need to go that way. And so we have these little inner conflicts going on, which is just two parts who have a different idea of what being okay is like for Ryan or for Matt or for whoever it is. And all of these parts want us to be okay, yet they just have very different ideas of how to get there. And some of them have completely diametrically opposing views. And we'll end up in absolute chaos up here because we can't recognize, even though both those voices seem like they're in opposite teams, that they both actually want the same thing for the overall human. You know, like back when I was using drugs, there was a part of me was like, you need to go and use, otherwise things aren't going to be okay. And other parts like, no, you don't need to, otherwise things aren't okay. But they just, you know, that they start these arguments, and we all have this to a varying degree.
Yeah.
And our relationship, we've already spoken about that really, Matt, haven't we? Like it's all about our relationship to, whether it's the emotion we're going through, whether it's the situation in front of us, whether it's the thoughts that we're having, but just to our direct suffering, which is what we're talking about today, having an awareness and a relationship to that.
Yeah, and it's learning to move towards our suffering, you know, in a really kind of titrated, healthy way. So, you know, it's like, oh, I have anxiety. I learn to befriend my anxiety. It's not like we just jump in head first into our trauma and, you know, flood our nervous system with sympathetic, anxious energy, you know, because that's unhelpful. It's like kind of drowning in it. But we learn to meet it, you know, we move in and out. We develop over time a more healthy relationship to ourselves. And this starts to ebb away, kind of, or erode away that inner resistance, you know, that inner argument, that inner wrestling with, you know, that's a good term, wrestling with my anxiety, which just makes me more tangled up, more conflict, more angst, you know, it makes me more kind of paralyzed, more stuck in it. You know, it's like what you resist persists. It's like, that's true, you know, but if I can learn to shift my relationship to it it can start to soften. My energy towards it, like my energy would be towards a baby or a child who's frightened, helps to calm the nervous system. And then the nervous system states can start to regulate themselves. And someone just asked about PTSD as well. So PTSD is a diagnostic term from the DSM, post-traumatic stress disorder. We don't talk about diagnoses. We just use trauma as an umbrella term and assist people metabolizing their experience. It's just basically the medical term for trauma, for what we're talking about. But it has a bunch of symptoms, and they tick boxes and then label someone as you've got a disorder, and often give medication to manage or suppress the symptoms of that. We work very differently, and we don't agree that trauma is a disorder. It's more of an injury adaptation kind of thing than a disorder. So we disagree with the medical model in that sense.
Yeah, yeah. So with PTSD, refer to that. I think it was the second slide, where we just spoke about trauma and that kind of thing, and that is how we would approach it. So we've already pretty much touched on this. Like story follows state, as Matt said. It's really important to notice that our this nervous system sense will come in first, and then it will give rise to a lot of these thoughts, bottom-up processing, our identity, veils, and beliefs. Identity might be a good one to talk about here. We have this physical self, this vessel that we're in, and so we will perceive threat to our physical body. Our physical body doesn't get much threat these days, as opposed to, thousands of years ago when we were, hunter-gatherer tribes. There were much bigger animals than us, and we didn't have the tools oftentimes to take them down. Rival tribes, there was famine a lot. So the physical, we still have the wiring of trying to protect our physical self, but we also have this psychological self, this identity structure, which gets made up from all the experiences we've had in our life. We create the idea of I, or who Ryan is. I'm a dad and I like golf and I do this for work and all this kind of stuff. And so whenever that identity starts to feel threatened or falls away, most people will go into a lot of suffering, because we will cling on to that familiar identity, because the ego loves that familiarity. It loves to be right, and it loves to, cling on to that. So identity is one that we find, especially in this work, because when we're doing things like embodied processing, we are challenging parts of the identity. And so major parts of our identity are often made up from traumatic imprints and traumatic experiences, developmental trauma. And so when we start to work through those, the idea of who I am can start to change. And that's a really interesting point for a lot of people on their journey, because it's like, I'm terrified about letting go of the known and stepping into the unknown of who I might be. And there's also that kind of craving and aversion, the craving to go back to the familiar known, even though that familiar known was causing pain and suffering. So there's this weird nexus point where it's so freeing. We see a client move into that place of, hey, let me find out who I am without this desperate need to be a people pleaser, or without this desperate need to be a drinker, or whatever it is. So identity is a really important one to talk about. Matt, inner unification and resolution. I put the peace sign up here. The end of conflict. Talk to us.
No conflict between our parts in the moment in front of us. So, it kind of speaks for itself, I think. The process of inner unification starts with shifting our relationship to what we're experiencing, from inner wrestling to a more compassionate, understanding, supportive kind of attitude, presence, to bringing our presence to our parts and our experience, even the part that wrestles, because there's a tendency to hear this, notice that we're wrestling with our experience. This is how deep the kind of the tendency goes, the habit goes. And it's like we see, oh yeah, well, I'm wrestling with my anxiety. Oh, you an idiot. Why are you doing that?
Now I'm
doing...
wrestling with the wrestler.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the instant kind of, reaction. We have a reaction to our reaction, and then we see that we're reacting. So we react to the fact that we're reacting. It's like being worried about something, and then you notice that you're worrying, like laying in bed at night, is a perfect example when you can't sleep. It's like you're laying there, maybe you got to get up in the morning, and it's like, oh, I can't sleep, for fuck's sake, and then the narrative starts, and then you notice, oh, it's my worrying that's keeping me awake. So then you try to stop worrying. So you start thinking about trying not to worry. So you're worrying about your worrying, and we end up in these knots, But rather than this, so the actual issue there is we're trying to resolve it with our mind. We're trying to kind of get rid of the mind with the mind, but it doesn't work because it just tangles us up further. So shifting our relationship to it, is becoming aware of our body, of noticing the state. We were saying story follows state. So learning to be with our experience in our body, to regulate it, to be with it in a safe way, to resource. And this is, this can be a very difficult and long process for a lot of people, especially if you've got, like, on the further spectrum of trauma, like more trauma than other people. And because the body can be a really difficult place to be, we can hold a lot of dysregulation and hold a lot of stored stress and fear in our body. So, like, learning to be with the body and learning to develop resource and safety and the ability to regulate, it can be a long kind of process, and it can require us to really shift a lot of the ways we live and the foods that we eat and the practices that we do, etc., etc., etc. And so when we start to shift that relationship and learn to be with our experience in a much healthier way, then the inner conflict starts to soften and erode away, and our inner conflict with the parts, our kind of rejection of ourselves. There's a Zen teacher named Adyashanti, and he's sort of Zen, like he's rooted in Zen, and he said, you'll likely embrace the entire universe before you fully embrace yourself. That's a kind of paraphrased him. But like the point's the same. And it's like embracing yourself. It's a journey, and a difficult journey. It's very easy for us to look at other people and embrace them, see what they're doing that's causing their suffering, have a more compassionate attitude towards them. But when we do it, it's like there's this inner critic, there's this part of us that's, like, no, there's something wrong with you. When we try to develop that attitude towards ourselves, it's much more difficult. But when we can do that, the conflict starts to soften, and that inner struggle can start to soften, even, by having compassion for the fact that we're struggling, bringing our presence and a caring, supportive attitude to the wrestling itself with reality can start to soften. It's like, those Chinese finger traps. You put your finger in each side, and the more you try to get out, like, the more you're stuck. Like, your fingers are stuck, but if you can just, they come out. If you can just relax with what's happening, learn to relax with what's happening, learn to be with what's happening, learn to metabolize and move things through, self-regulate, etc., etc. And like I said, that can be a very long journey for people. Then inner unification starts to happen. Thought, action, and intention more aligned, more integrated. Not so contracted and kind of wobbling every time we want to do something. More spontaneous, more natural, more effortless ourselves when we talk, when we act, etc., etc., etc. More trust in ourselves, not parts at war, like, don't do this, don't say that, don't do this, etc., etc. And our conditioning can start to kind of unravel. And, then I would say that's the process of becoming an integrated human being, with wholeness, from moving and orienting from a place of inner unification and wholeness.
Yeah, beautiful. I love it. And someone just asked if Body Keeps the Score is a good book for a reference. Yep, we definitely recommend that one. That'll give you an intellectual knowledge. What I would do as well is have some experiential knowledge as well, which is actually even more important. And, one thing you can start with is taking a moment each day, maybe in the morning, to check in with those bodily sensations, what we call the somatic identity. So what does it feel like to be you in this moment? And that's something that changes from day to day, week to week, from moment to moment sometimes. But we can take a moment and check in and just say, hey, let me take 10 minutes here to feel inside what it's like to be Ryan. But then the other one is we don't wrestle with whatever arises. And that's a practice as well. We learn to go, okay, let's say that I'm feeling anxious, or I'm feeling angry or resentful, or, worrying about the future. Then it's being okay with that. It's noticing if we start to wrestle with it and then sinking back into it. And over time, we learn what we're doing there. It doesn't sound like much, but it's so important in what we've been talking about, of developing a relationship to what we're experiencing, not being in resistance to the reality of what's happening in our body and how we're showing up in that moment. And then like Matt said, things will start to unwind. And when we have big things come up, we'll probably need to work with a practitioner and have a helping hand guide us through that process. But we unwind the conditioning, the nervous system states, the traumatic imprints, all of these suppressed emotions that are held in the body. And I saw a comment here somewhere that, yeah, when you start to feel safer in your body, more trauma will surface. Yeah, it will. Layers will start to come up. Once we work through a certain layer, we're not done. All our body will say is, okay, this human being, or our subconscious will say this human being is now resourced enough to let up this next layer of trauma. And what it's doing, it's bringing them up for resolution. Like we spoke about at the very, very start, it's like the body heals the cut, some greater intelligence than our conscious mind heals the cut. These traumas are coming up so they can be resolved and moved through our system. But all human beings, we seem to have they're banked up quite a bit. So we remove one layer, and the next one arises. So then it's like, can I be okay with that? Can I be okay with this next layer rising? Can I be okay when I believe that I've worked through all of my mum stuff and mother wounds and everything? Then, 2 years later, another layer of mother stuff comes up. Can I be okay with that? Or am I going to go into resistance and start wrestling with that?
Someone just asked, is your thinking tied in with yoga principles? Yeah, we weave in understandings of yoga, not like the kind of trim your waistline, modern day kind of yoga, but more the ancient wisdom where it's about the nervous system and resolving contractions and conflictions to get the prana energy moving, etc. We use different language, but we've definitely been inspired.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about samskaras, a lot in the training. Yoga, only one of the yoga disciplines is to do with the stretching and physical movement. The rest of it is with the mind and how to live life and that kind of thing. So we do love those principles.
Yeah, yoga
and
means
again,
no union to yoga. It means the inner unification into oneness. And it like we don't go too much into kind of the spiritual aspects of it. We just take the kind of basic stuff, not that we don't apply them in our own lives, but in the actual training, yeah, we definitely align with a lot of what they talk about.
Yeah. All right, just to finish up here, we've had quite a few questions about, what is EP, what is embodied processing? It is a practitioner training for modality myself and Matt created. Students and practitioners all around the world now. We just love our embodied processing community. We believe that empowering individuals with the understanding and skills to help themselves and others relieve stress and trauma in the body will change the world. And I can see it's already happening, not just with EP, with as everyone else doing this kind of teaching and helping people be more trauma informed in all industries and all different workplaces and everything. It's only going to benefit us as human beings and as a society. And just the orientation we always take with EP, and it's an orientation. I spoke about little exercises of somatic identity before. Let's see if we can take the orientation that a practitioner of EP is to take with the client, and that is all is welcome here. All parts of you are welcome here. There's no parts of you that you should be banishing, suppressing, hiding. You're all welcome. Okay. If we can take that orientation with ourselves, the wrestling stops. Okay. All of us is welcome, and you're not broken. We're not here to fix you. If we can let go of the notion that we're broken, then, as soon as I'm in front of another human being, if I'm talking to Matt and if I deep look at Matt and even just feel and think inside that, man, this guy's broken, he needs to be fixed, that further embeds the problem that Matt would have because he already feels broken and it needs to be fixed. So very, very important if we can take this orientation with ourselves. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. This has been great. We had a really active chat box. We hope you've taken something away from this. If you're watching the replay, just put hashtag replay and any comments or questions that you have. It'll be available in the feed here. It's going to be up as a blog on the Center for Healing website, thecenterforhealing.com. And yes, we're getting a lot of thank yous here. No, thank you all. We just love that we're able to talk about these things that we're incredibly passionate about. I'm actually up at Matt's house in country Victoria at the minute in a different room. We were out for dinner last night talking about how amazing it is that, we can do this as a job. It's not really a job, it's just we have to talk about really cool, deep human stuff. And the fact that it's resonating with people all over the globe just fills us with gratitude. So have a great day, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, guys. See ya.